again, as promised, we're back, and I want to talk about the concept of capital. Obviously, we're talking about capitalism, which of course derives its name from the crucial role of capital in the economic process, in the market process. But I want to ask you, what is capital? Right, it's one of those terms, once again, that people use quite often without really having an understanding of what they're talking about. So I'm going to try to explain to you what capital is and how it emerges in a market economy. And I think the best way to do that I have found is, I think one of the reasons that there's so much confusion about economics is because we live in a highly complex economic system. This huge developed economy that it becomes very difficult to identify the elements that are underlying the entire process. So let's put that aside. I ask you to sort of imaginatively go with me to Robinson Crusoe's desert island. So there we are. Here's Robinson Crusoe alone on his desert island. As we said, Robinson Crusoe, like every other person who's ever lived on Earth, he has an economic problem. He too is confronted by the irremediable fact of scarcity, of limited resources. His resources are limited. So let's say he's on, to make my example flow more easily, let's say he's on a tropical island somewhere, surrounded by water. Now his resources are very limited. He has himself, his mind, and his labor, right, and whatever is naturally given there in his environment. But he has priorities. He needs certain things to survive, let alone flourish. His first problem is mere survival. So he has to devote his limited resources to his highest priorities. So let's say he has enough water. Let's say there's enough rain, there's a pool there, he can drink water. So what would next be high on his list? I'm going to use the example of food, although when I've taught this class in the past, I had several veterans in my class, and they tell me that what they are trained to do if they're in a situation like this is the first thing they need to do is build shelter. That's probably true, but to make my example easier, I'm going to say that Robinson decides that he needs food. So he's got water, so he needs food. Okay, so he has to get food. So he's surrounded by water, so he gets the idea he's going to try to catch a fish. Okay, doesn't have a lot of, he's got himself and his energy, so he's out there wading around in the water trying to catch a fish with his bare hands. Not so simple, but he has urgent need, so he remains devoted to this, and he works at it and works at it and works at it. And let's say, just for purposes of my example, that he eventually succeeds within the relevant time frame of catching a fish. And let's say he needs 1 fish per day to survive for calories and so forth. So he caught a fish, so he survives another day. He eats the fish, and he wakes up the next day and he's alive. So he does it again. He goes out and tries to catch a fish. And so let's say he keeps doing this day after day after day. And with practice, he gets better and better at it. So he's getting better and better at catching a fish with his bare hands. So he does this every day he catches a fish, he survives another day and so forth. But eventually, as I said, he gets better at it, and so let's say one day he catches 2 fish. All right, this is a decisive moment for him because he is potentially on the path to economic growth and development, to possessing capital. Now, how so? So he has 2 fish. All right, so whether he's on this path, whether he's actually going to succeed in increasing his wealth or not will depend on his decision. He has a decision to make with these 2 fish. Well, he has a couple choices. He can either, he can eat both. All right, and who could blame him? He's been living on 1 fish for 1 day, suddenly he has 2, so he's going to have a feast to celebrate. It's understandable, but that's not a very wise choice. The wise choice under the circumstances would be what? To eat 1 of the fish to stay alive, and then, and here's the decisive point here, then to save the 2nd fish. If he saves that fish, that's his investment, and he can possibly begin to build his capital. So he has 1 fish he eats, the 2nd fish he saves. He's wealthier now at the end of the day than he was the day before, where before he had 1 fish, he ate it, was gone. Now he has 1 fish he ate, And the second one, he has his savings, he's wealthier. So the next day he wakes up and he's got another fish. So what does that do for him? What should he do? What's the best, the wisest decision he can make here now? He's got now more resources than he had the day before. In fact, he has another 24 hours of time. He doesn't have to spend his day catching a fish because he has one. So he can use those additional resources, those hours he saved for himself by not eating the second fish, he can use them to meet other needs. What other needs? What's the best use of those? What should he do with those hours he has now, that as a result of his saving the second fish? What's the best thing he could do? People will come up with all kinds of various ideas, but if you were in class, I'd ask for your suggestions now, but since you're not in front of me, I'm going to tell you the best thing that he could do. The best thing he could do is to use those new resources, that extra time, to create for himself a tool. Now, what is a tool? Human beings have become so successful and so productive because we have learned how to use tools. Tools are actually a kind of a luxury. You can't eat a tool directly. You can't consume a tool. It's what economists call a producer's good, right? It's used to produce things that people can actually consume. And so the only way you have the luxury to create a tool is if you already have enough to survive on. And he's got his fish. He's got that. So he has the luxury of using that time not to meet a direct consumption need, but to put that time into building a tool. So let's say he decides, he's clever, he's wise, and he decides to use that time to build himself, let's say, a net. Let's say maybe there are long vines and so forth throughout the island. He goes and collects them and he weaves himself a primitive net. That is a very wise use of that time. He's got a tool now, because tools enormously increase man's productivity. So he eats the second fish on the second day, while he also now was able to use the additional time to make himself a net. So the next morning he wakes up, he's not back to go, now he's got a net. So let's say he goes out then into the water, and with the net, let's just say that he's able to catch 5 fish or 10 fish, depending on how many. He's enormously wealthier than he was as a result of having the tool, than having to catch a fish with his hands. And so this second fish that he saved, his investment, that became his capital, the resources that he can use to invest in the production of tools, things that are not direct consumption goods, but are producers' goods, things that increase the productivity of labor and therefore ultimately increase production. So he now can, having the net, using that, saving his extra fish and using that time made available to invest in a producer's good, in a net, now he benefits in the long run, because now he can produce much, much more, catch 5 or 10 fish rather than 1 fish, and he's enormously wealthier. And that was accomplished, that fish, his investment, which became a net, that's his capital. And that's how capital is developed anywhere in society. And what are the prerequisites for the beginning formation of capital? There are a couple things that have to happen before any person or any society has the luxury of building up their capital, the things they can use for investing in productive tools. First thing that has to happen, and many countries in the world don't have even this bare minimum, is that a person or a people more generally have to produce enough, more than they need for mere subsistence. If Robinson never could produce more than 1 fish, every day he eats that fish and he's back to go every day. He's always starting at the beginning. He's not able to take off to get involved in economic growth. So at least at some point he has to be able to produce more than he needs to survive. And then he has to make the correct decision to save that extra production and invest it in the production of a tool. So, as I said, many people today in the world, they spend their entire days working brutally hard labor, 15, 16 hours a day, and they barely can produce enough to meet the subsistence needs of themselves and their families. So they can never get off the ground. They don't have the luxury of devoting some of their production into tools. They have to eat it to survive. So you have to to get capital formation started, you have to be able to, at the beginning, at least to produce more than you need to survive, and then you have to make the correct decision to save it and invest it in the production of tools. So, as I said, this is one reason why so many peoples have had undeveloped economies for centuries and centuries, because they were never able to produce more than they needed for subsistence. And you can't get off the ground without, that's the first thing that is necessary. Second thing then that is necessary is to delay your gratification, to take the extra production above subsistence needs and not consume it, but save it and invest it in tools, in non-consumable goods, because tools are what vastly increase the productivity of labor. And the reason we are so successful in the West, America being the paradigmatic example, is because we are the benefits of enormous amounts of capital investment over the centuries. Think about how much capital we have to work with. When you go to work somewhere, we have power tools and buildings and technology and electricity, and it surrounds us everywhere, these tools that enormously enhance our own productivity. How much more productive are we that we can use a power tool rather than to build a house, rather than digging in the ground with our fingers, right? To give you an example. We take this for granted, but we live in this enormous wealth of capital formation. Now, how do all these things come to be? Well, they came to be in the exact same process that I've just described for Robinson Crusoe. Somewhere along the line in the West, and there's lots of scholarly literature on this subject about exactly when this process began, of this capital formation, but one of the key points in modern Western history was in the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation, say in England, which became the home of the so-called Industrial Revolution in the later century. But there were groups of people, there's sort of a religious dimension to this as well. Scholars often write about the significance of the Calvinists in England, who were very austere people. They believed that they were the elect and so forth, but they had to prove that they were the elect by worldly success. So they were very good, kind of granite-faced people, very austere and certainly not self-indulgent, and they worked very hard. But they didn't spend it on things, they saved it, and they built up this pool of capital, of savings, of investment, and then they invested it in the production of tools, of factories. All right, you all know about of the tools that fueled the Industrial Revolution, the spinning jenny and all kinds of other tools that enormously increased the productivity of labor. So the laboring class, which for centuries had lived at subsistence level, you know, agriculture was the dominant economic activity prior to the Industrial Revolution, and people were very poor. Their productivity was very low, and they mainly just eked out a living, a subsistence living. But with the generation of this new class of people who worked very hard, saved their money, and then invested it in tools, in factories, the laboring class blossomed, because now they have all of this equipment, these tools to work with, which enormously increased their own productivity and then eventually increased their own wages and standard of living, because wages generally tend to be a product of the productivity of labor. The more productive labor is, the higher the wages that are paid for it. So this is what fueled the enormous growth in wealth and material prosperity in the West. The process continues to this day. People who produce things, they produce more than they personally need to survive. They don't spend it on themselves, they save it, and then they invest it in producers' goods, in equipment, tools, some very, very sophisticated, obviously. Think of our automotive industries and so forth, and our oil and gas industries. I mean, this enormous technology, this capital investment. But that is all the result of someone having produced more than they needed to consume, saved it, and then put it into the creation of these tools, these, as I said, the tremendous capital that we all enjoy as members of American society. But all of that was the result of people saving and investing. And why did they put it into the production of tools? To increase the productivity of labor, and therefore increase the output, and therefore increase their own profits in the end. And the only reason they did that in the West is because we, for many centuries, have honored a certain set of moral and legal rules that encouraged the formation of capital in this manner. Because what's necessary for that process to work? First of all, there has to be a secure rule of law. There has to be a society that has laws that protect private property. Number one, we've mentioned this before. So that if you are willing to take the risk of investing your savings in the production of goods and services, you have to know that if you are successful and make a profit, you're going to be able to keep that profit. You can't have it just whisked away by government taxing it away, because that undermines the whole incentive to get involved in this process. Because let's remember, the process of capital investment, it's a risky business. You may think that what you're putting your money into producing is going to, the consumers are going to want to buy it at the price that you're offering it at, but you have no guarantee of that. You take a risk, and profit is one of the rewards and elements of one of the rewards for risk taking, because you also always face the danger of loss.